In the fading light of a late afternoon, the sun hung low over the streets of New Orleans, casting long, golden shadows that stretched across the cracked sidewalks. For Lieutenant Natalie Jackson, returning home felt surreal. The neighborhood, once vibrant with memories of childhood, seemed unchanged, but nothing felt quite the same. It had been years since she last walked these streets, years since she left for the military and buried her father. And now, at 38, she found herself walking back through the streets of her past, her boots heavy against the pavement. The corner store was still there, its neon sign buzzing with that all-too-familiar buy one, get one free offer on sodas. The same barber shop sat at the end of the block, its faded sign barely holding on. The sounds of children laughing and playing basketball on the same old court where she spent her teenage years echoed in the air. It all felt so familiar, yet so foreign. She adjusted the duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her military posture a stark contrast to the casual energy of the neighborhood. A fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, and worn-out sneakers were all she wore, but even in civilian clothes, her presence commanded respect. Years of discipline had shaped her, taught her to stand tall, chin up, and step forward with confidence. As she passed a group of teenagers hanging out by the corner store, one of them caught sight of her. His eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed with curiosity. He took a step toward her, his voice hesitant but respectful. "You military?" he asked. Natalie met his gaze, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Something like that," she replied, her voice steady, as the familiar weight of home settled around her. As Natalie continued walking, her footsteps steady and unwavering, she felt the weight of the years that had passed since she had left this neighborhood. The streets, though filled with familiar sights, now seemed like a distant memory. She had changed, grown stronger, sharper, more aware of the world around her, but there was something in the air here that still clung to her, a kind of pull, like gravity, trying to remind her of who she was before the military, before the long deployments, before everything she had become. Her dark brown eyes scanned the street, taking in the faces of those around her. The older woman on the porch, waving at a neighbor. The kids on bikes who zoomed past her, as carefree as she had once been. And the smell of fried food, drifting from Miss Laverne's corner diner, made her stomach rumble in spite of the years she'd spent eating rations in far-off lands. The sounds of laughter, of life continuing despite everything. She had missed this. She had missed home. But something in her had shifted. She wasn't the same person who had walked these streets before. Her military training had ingrained a new sense of self, one that was defined by purpose, discipline, and strength. Even in civilian clothes, she carried herself differently. There was a presence about her, a stillness in the way she moved that told anyone who looked closely she wasn't just another woman on the block. She was a woman who had seen things, done things. And though the city felt like home, she couldn't help but wonder if she had become a stranger to it. She adjusted her duffel bag over her shoulder, the weight of it a reminder of all she had left behind to serve, and all she had carried with her since. She hadn't come back here looking for answers, but as she walked, she realized maybe, just maybe, she was still looking for herself. As Natalie rounded the corner, she could feel the cool evening air brushing against her skin, a welcome relief from the heaviness of the day. The neighborhood was alive, with its usual rhythm, people coming and going, music spilling out of open windows, kids chasing each other down the block. But then, like a sudden shift in the wind, she noticed the patrol car slowly rolling up beside her. Something about it felt off. The way the car crawled through the neighborhood, its tires barely making a sound on the cracked pavement, was enough to make her pause. She didn't turn, didn't look over, but she knew what was coming. And sure enough, the window rolled down, and a voice, gravelly and sharp, called out, "Excuse me, miss." Officer Mark Cooper's voice was thick with a tone she had heard 100 times before. The kind of voice that assumed it was in charge, no questions asked. Natalie stopped and turned slightly, her expression unreadable. She dealt with men like him before, men who saw a confident woman walking alone and assumed she was up to no good. Men who didn't see the years of experience, the discipline, the calm beneath the surface. They just saw someone they could push around. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" Cooper asked, his eyes scanning her up and down, sizing her up. Natalie's lips quirked into a smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. She had half a mind to ask him if he needed a map to navigate his own neighborhood, but she didn't. Instead, she simply shifted the strap of her duffel bag, steadying herself before she replied, "Just walking." Cooper didn't like that. He leaned out of the window, narrowing his eyes. "Where to?" Natalie arched an eyebrow, glancing over at the nearby street signs. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street," she said, voice smooth but carrying a subtle edge. The silence between them thickened as Cooper's jaw clenched. Natalie could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. She wasn't here for a fight, but she wasn't going to back down either. Not now, not ever. And just like that, she realized this wasn't just about a woman on the street. This was about power, and he wasn't going to win this one. The tension between them was palpable, the kind of electric atmosphere that made the air feel heavier with each passing second. Officer Mark Cooper wasn't backing down, and neither was Natalie. She could feel his eyes on her, scanning her like she was the last piece of pie at a family reunion, something to be claimed, something to be controlled. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of flinching. Her military training had taught her one thing: stay steady, no matter what. Cooper shifted his stance, leaning out further from the patrol car, his sunglasses reflecting the setting sun like a cheap movie villain. "We've had some break-ins around here," he said, voice thick with fake concern. "Just making sure everything's in order." His hand rested on the door frame, trying to project authority, but there was something in the way his fingers tapped against the car that told her he wasn't quite as sure of himself as he pretended. Natalie fought the urge to roll her eyes. She'd heard that excuse 1,000 times before. It was as old as the neighborhood itself. She wasn't interested in indulging him. "You see me breaking into something?" she asked flatly, crossing her arms in a way that made it clear she wasn't going to play along with his little game. Cooper's jaw twitched, the muscle there tightening with frustration. He was losing control, and it showed in the way he shifted his weight, in the way his voice cracked just a little. "Just doing my job," he muttered, though the words didn't sound as confident as he wanted them to. Natalie leaned in slightly, a smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "Well, I'm just walking," she said, her voice even, a complete contrast to the simmering annoyance Cooper was trying so hard to hide. She wasn't in a hurry to prove anything, but it was clear he wasn't going to win this one. The longer he stood there trying to intimidate her, the more ridiculous he looked, and she was starting to enjoy the show. As the seconds stretched, Natalie could feel the crowd around them begin to grow. She didn't need to look to know they were watching. You could always tell when people started paying attention. It wasn't the sound of shuffling feet or whispers, it was the stillness. That odd silence that filled the space, almost like the entire street was holding its breath. She could hear the faint hum of the distant traffic, the occasional clink of metal against the sidewalk, and the low murmurs of the people gathering to see what would happen next. Officer Mark Cooper clearly hadn't noticed. He was too focused on Natalie, still leaning out of his patrol car, trying to maintain his grip on the situation. But Natalie wasn't going to give him that luxury. He was clearly trying to intimidate her, his stance widening, his fingers twitching near his holster like he was expecting her to flinch. But Natalie wasn't flinching, not now, not ever. Then, just as the tension seemed to reach a breaking point, she caught the flash of a phone in the corner of her eye. A woman across the street was holding up her phone, clearly recording. She wasn't hiding it. The lens pointed directly at Cooper, and his very obvious power struggle with a woman who wasn't about to cower. The moment the camera came out, something in the air shifted. Cooper stiffened, his eyes flicking from Natalie to the woman, and his smirk faltered, just enough to notice. Natalie couldn't help but smirk herself. It was funny how quickly things changed once the crowd knew they were watching. The stakes were no longer just between her and Cooper, they were now the audience's as well. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in the woman's direction, signaling that she knew exactly what was happening. People weren't just bystanders anymore, they were witnesses. And Natalie wasn't going to give Cooper the satisfaction of thinking he could get away with this. Not when everyone was watching. The crowd was getting thicker now. It wasn't just a woman with the phone, more people had started to gather, their curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding in the middle of their block. A couple of kids on bikes had stopped to watch, their eyes wide, some whispering to each other, while an older man by the food truck stood, arms folded, clearly judging the situation with a furrowed brow. Natalie felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze locked on Officer Cooper, who was now clearly starting to lose his grip on the situation. He'd expected her to crack under the pressure. Maybe he thought she'd be intimidated by the uniform or by the badge that, to him, meant authority. But Natalie wasn't that woman. She wasn't going to be bullied into submission. And as the minutes dragged on, it was obvious to everyone watching that she wasn't backing down. Cooper's frustration was growing, his jaw tightening with every word that came out of her mouth. "You think you're too good to answer simple questions, huh?" He shot at her, his tone thick with arrogance. But Natalie didn't bite. She simply held her ground, her eyes calm, unwavering. "You're not the one to tell me how to walk down my own street," she said coolly, feeling a flicker of satisfaction when she saw his jaw tighten even more. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She knew exactly what he wanted, a reaction, something to prove his power. But she wasn't giving him the satisfaction. As the tension stretched, something finally broke in Cooper. He snapped, his frustration spilling out into a demand for her ID. But by now, the scene was no longer just about two people on a street corner, it was about a power struggle playing out in front of a growing audience. And Natalie was determined not to let him win. Not today. Not when everyone was watching. She slowly reached into her pocket, pulling out her military ID, but she didn't hand it over. Instead, she held it up in front of him, offering him a silent challenge. "Check it," she said simply. The game had just changed. Natalie could feel the tension in the air shift as Cooper took a moment to squint at the ID she held up. She didn't flinch, not even when his gaze flickered from the ID to her face, as if trying to find some crack in her calm demeanor. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking at, whether he was trying to confirm her story or if he was just waiting for her to make a mistake. Either way, she wasn't giving him the satisfaction. "Military, huh?" Cooper said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Navy SEALs, huh? That's cute." His voice was low, a mockery of something he couldn't even begin to understand. He turned the ID over in his hands like it was a joke, like she wasn't a woman who had seen the worst of the world and made it out alive. But Natalie wasn't here to convince him of her service. She was here to remind him who was in control. Cooper's face twisted into that familiar smirk, the one that said he thought he'd won. The problem was, he didn't know she wasn't going to give him the reaction he was fishing for. She'd encountered men like him before, those who looked at her and saw a target, not realizing they were standing in the way of someone who had no fear of confrontation. He could mock her all he wanted, but it didn't matter. She was used to this. "Return it," Natalie said, her voice firm now, and something in her eyes told Cooper this wasn't a suggestion. But he wasn't finished yet. He leaned in a little closer, trying to size her up. "You sure that ID's legit?" he asked, voice low and accusatory. "Run it through your system," Natalie replied, her tone icy now, like she was talking to a child. "You'll find out soon enough." The crowd was watching. No one had moved, no one had blinked. The moment was hanging in the air, like the calm before a storm. And all Natalie had to do was stand there, unshaken. As Officer Cooper fumbled with the ID in his hand, Natalie could feel the crowd's energy shift. The silence had become a tightrope walk, the kind that makes you hold your breath without even realizing it. People weren't just watching, they were waiting for something to happen, and they were ready to record it, to share it, to make it their own personal front-page news. Natalie was keenly aware of the phones that were now raised, capturing the unfolding drama. She could almost hear the buzz of social media notifications in the air, but Cooper didn't seem to care. He was too busy twisting her military ID between his fingers like it was some kind of novelty. A child playing with a toy he didn't quite understand. Navy SEALs, huh? He repeated, dragging out the words like he was reading a bedtime story. That's cute. His tone was dripping with mockery, and Natalie could feel a familiar, simmering annoyance building in her chest. It was always the same, with men like him, men who saw a woman in uniform and thought she didn't belong. They wanted to prove something, wanted to knock her down to size. But Natalie wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She had been trained for worse than this. The sands of Afghanistan, the streets of Baghdad. Cooper didn't know what it was like to face danger every day, to have to keep your cool when your life was on the line. He certainly didn't know what it took to be a woman in a world that still believed in outdated stereotypes. "Return it," she said, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. It wasn't a request, it was a command. She could see the twitch in his jaw, the momentary flicker of doubt in his eyes. He wasn't used to being talked to like this, but it didn't matter. Natalie had already won. He just didn't know it yet. "Run it through your system," she added smoothly, her tone barely shifting. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, she knew this was only just beginning. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not today, not ever. Natalie could feel the change in the air before she heard it, the subtle shift in the crowd's energy. The murmurs had gone quiet, the occasional chatter fading as the second patrol car rolled up. Sergeant Dave Burke stepped out with the kind of calculated authority that could only come from years of experience on the force. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, instantly assessing the situation. It didn't take him long to notice the tension in Cooper's body, the tight fists, the flushed face. And then he saw the crowd, phones raised, capturing everything. Burke didn't need to ask questions, he already knew something had gone wrong. Cooper's eyes flashed with frustration, his pride bruised in front of an audience. He opened his mouth to speak, but Burke held up a hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. The older officer's gaze never left Cooper as he turned to Natalie, giving her a brief, assessing look. "Lieutenant Jackson," Burke said, his voice steady. "I didn't realize you were back in town." Natalie simply nodded, her expression calm, though she could feel the weight of his recognition. The moment Burke had said her rank, everything shifted. Cooper's bravado evaporated. The mask of authority he'd tried to wear crumbled in front of his superior officer. Burke turned to Cooper, his tone cold. "Explain yourself," he ordered. Cooper's words were stiff, barely above a whisper. She resisted, he muttered, his voice strained, wouldn't comply. Got aggressive. The crowd reacted immediately, a few scoffs, a muttered boo from the back. Burke exhaled, glancing at the cameras that had caught every moment. He didn't need to make any further judgments. The situation was clear. The real lesson was in how power shifted when the right people showed up. "Officer Cooper," Burke said, his voice now cutting through the tension, "you're relieved of duty. Effective immediately." The words stung, and for a moment, Natalie almost felt bad for the man. Almost. She knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the lesson learned here. You can't walk around with an inflated sense of power, thinking you can control people. Not when the people you're trying to control are people who have fought harder battles than this one. You can't break someone just because you're in uniform, especially when they've already worn one that's seen more conflict than most will ever know. As Cooper stood there, speechless, Natalie's gaze didn't waver. She didn't need to say anything. The lesson had already been taught. As Officer Cooper slunk away, defeated, his head hanging low, the crowd's energy shifted from curiosity to satisfaction. The tension that had clouded the air just moments before now seemed to dissipate like a storm breaking. Sergeant Burke stood there, his posture still commanding, eyes flicking from the now quiet Cooper to Natalie, who stood unfazed by the whole ordeal. She wasn't gloating, wasn't reveling in her small victory. She was just standing, and in a way, that was the biggest power move she could make. Burke let out a deep breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Understood," he muttered, as if finally realizing the weight of the situation. He turned back to Cooper, who was now retreating to his squad car, shoulders slumped, his uniform no longer carrying the same weight it had earlier. The moment Cooper climbed into the car and slammed the door shut, the crowd murmured their last thoughts, some of them still unsure of how everything had played out, but most with a sense of approval, their phones still in hand. "Lieutenant," Burke said, addressing Natalie, "you handled yourself well." "Too well." There was a brief pause before he added, "He's got to learn. You don't walk into situations thinking you own the power. People see that." Natalie nodded, her expression thoughtful. She had seen this play out before in war zones, on base, in the cities that felt both foreign and familiar. Power wasn't about uniforms, badges, or even rank. Power was about respect. You could wear all the armor in the world, but if you didn't know when to listen, when to step back, when to keep your cool, you'd lose every time. "Does it ever change anything?" she asked, voice low as she glanced over at Burke. "Or do we just keep fighting the same fight over and over?" Burke exhaled sharply, looking at her with a mixture of understanding and exhaustion. "It might not change everything, but it changes something," he said, meeting her gaze. "Sometimes that's enough." Natalie didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, the weight of the situation settling in. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things could change. Not everything, not right away, but one fight at a time, one lesson at a time, until it mattered. She turned to leave, the small crowd behind her already dispersing, phones down, their curiosity satisfied. "I keep walking," she said quietly, more to herself than to Burke. And as she did, she realized that sometimes the real victory wasn't in winning. It was in staying true to who you were, even when the world tried to push you aside.